Now, what should we expect at the upcoming local elections on the 3rd of May? Joining me is Gideon Skinner, Head of Political Research at Ipsos MORI, and Matt Shaddick, Head of Political Betting at Ladbrokes. And let's talk about London first, because there's been a lot of noise in the press over the last few days in particular that it's going to be a disaster for the Conservatives. It's, red Labour, it's going to be total wipeout. Matt, you've been looking at this. What's the noise behind this? Is it matching what you're seeing?
Not really. I mean, I think the Tories are doing a very good job of managing expectations by claiming that they're in danger of losing all sorts of councils across London. The odds are saying something slightly different. So, I mean, some of the councils that are potentially in danger include Westminster, but most of the money there recently has been for the Tories to hold on there. Labour are a long way back. Wandsworth looks very close, quite plausible Labour could win that, but I wouldn't be that surprised if the Tories held on. They're outsiders, but not by very much. And I guess one of the most interesting ones is Barnet, which in theory is the easiest council for Labour to gain, because they've only got to flip a couple of wards to win that one. But we do have the additional problem in Barnet of it's the council area with the highest percentage of Jewish voters in the entire country, I think. And that is going to make things slightly more difficult for Labour, I believe. Let's
just have a look at the graphic then of the odds you've got going on. So as you mentioned there, the Labour Party, anti-Semitism has been a key running story now for quite a few weeks. It's been a long-term, always underlying though, very large Jewish population. The significance of that in terms of performance in elections, that could have a real impact.
Well, it could do in Barnet because, as I say, they've got a very high percentage. Well, I mean, when we say high percentage, I think about 20% of the voters there are Jewish, so it's still a minority. And when we first issued odds on this a few weeks ago, Labour were, very, very strong favourites. But in the last couple of weeks, understandably, people have started backing the Tories to hold this council. I mean, it could be pretty close. I mean, I think the Tories only have a 1 or 2 seat majority as it is already. But it is quite hard to believe that anybody in a Jewish community who didn't vote for an Ed Miliband-led Labour Party 4 years ago when these seats last came up are going to switch to a Corbyn-led Labour Party right now. So that's a definite impediment there. Although the odds still say there's about an 75-80% chance Labour will take control.
So in terms of London in general then, in sort of your general expectations is Conservatives don't expect necessarily as bad performance as is being commented on at the moment, and Labour, yes, the anti-Semitism scandal, particularly in some London areas, will have possibly an impact, but still maybe not too many upsets in terms of big losses from Labour as well.
Yeah, so we think Labour will get a higher percentage of the vote than they did last time around these seats were fought. We think they'll get more councillors, but whether they'll end up winning many more councils in London, well, they should win Barnet, we've talked about that. They'll probably win Wandsworth if the money is correct, but that's close. But that might be it. They might only win 2, maybe 3. Hillingdon's close. And so I think if that's the case, the Tories will be able to spin this as being a reasonably successful night for them.
And you've had Tory Party Chairman Brandon Lewis saying retaining seats in London would be challenging, possibly then another example of the expectation management of on the night, perhaps when the results aren't that bad, all of a sudden, a vindication of Theresa May as having found her mojo as being a strong leader and perhaps not necessarily hemorrhaging the support to Corbynism and Corbyn's Labour.
Yeah, exactly. But aside from just the spin that will happen the day after the election, I mean, there's the question of whether the Tories really are going to be struggling to win any or many seats in London in the long term, or whether 2017 was just a bit of a one-off. So if they lose Westminster and they lose Wandsworth and they lose councils in the southwest of London to the Lib Dems, then that's going to be a worrying sign for them.
Gideon, let's talk about London more generally and what the data is saying. How does it compare, for example, to what's going on in the rest of the country as well? This is, of course, bigger than London. What have you found there?
Oh yeah, so it's always a mistake to treat London as a completely different country, and also to treat London as just one single homogenous group. I mean, as Matthew's been talking about, different areas will have different views. But if you do take London as a whole and look at public opinion there compared with the rest of the country, there's probably around 3 areas you can see there are differences. So the issues that Londoners are concerned about are different. They've got different political views, and of course their views on Brexit are quite different. So in terms of their issues that they're concerned about, Londoners tend to be more worried about things like the economy, jobs and housing, and they're less concerned about big issues like immigration. for example, and the NHS actually is a bit of a less of an issue in London than elsewhere. In politics, London is obviously a left-leaning city. They're less positive about Theresa May, more positive about Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, and there has been a bit of a long-term trend for the Conservatives of their vote share dipping in London, going back to the 90s, and then that took a real big hit in 2017. So they're going to be concerned about at least their vote share in London, particularly inner London. And then on Brexit, we know that London, was more Remain, particularly on the single market. Again, Londoners are much more concerned about maintaining links to the single market, slightly less bothered about immigration controls compared with the rest of the country.
What about, you mentioned there specifically, inner London. What about the suburbs, and in terms of Labour? Picking up vote there, picking up support there. Does Labour have a bit of a suburban problem when it comes to London in particular?
So they tend not to perform as well. And
that's consistent to what you're expecting?
Yeah, exactly. And there was a poll recently in the Evening Standard from Queen Mary University that showed that the swing to Labour was much bigger in inner London than it was in outer London, but there was still a swing to Labour in outer London. So Labour might still be hoping to improve its vote share in some of those suburban areas, even if they don't win the councils.
This is obviously, at least in the press, it's about the leaders, it's about Corbyn versus May, Corbynism, the revived Labour Party versus Theresa May suddenly finding some energy or at least some strength, particularly in the context of the Russian nerve agent attack and whatnot. Let's just have a look at a graphic with regards to Theresa May. Satisfied with the way doing job in London, 31%. 36% though, slightly bigger across the country. Dissatisfied, still 61% in London, 55%. So still then indications are Theresa May is not seen particularly well.
Yeah, and on a national picture, her ratings have actually been slightly improving over the last couple of months, partly due to kind of getting the latest agreement on Brexit. But yeah, she compared with where she was before the 2017 election, where she was getting kind of record scores for a prime minister in our polling going back to the 70s. We've rarely ever seen anyone with as good a scores then. She's now much more in just a kind of an average position, and in London her scores are slightly worse, as are the Conservative parties.
Yeah, Matt, in terms of, we've spoken about Corbyn, particularly in the context of anti-Semitism. In terms of, what London's feeling, and perhaps, nationally, what the feeling is as well, how important are the leaders here? Are there any key indications that they are a big influential factor in how people are going to vote?
I think I've read some analysis of the sort of literature that's going out for the local elections in London, which are saying that both the Labour and the Tory parties are leaving their leaders off the communications they're sending. Especially Labour focuses on Shaddick Khan, who's incredibly popular compared to the two main party leaders. And I think a lot of it will come down to, when we're talking about issues like crime, which has become a big talking point recently.
Past few days, yeah.
Now, there's two ways of looking at it. Are Londoners going to blame Shaddick Khan for the apparent rise in some crime figures, or is this more likely to come down to blaming the government for cuts to police numbers and so on? And I think at the moment, Shaddick Khan is doing a pretty good job of winning that argument, so I think that'll probably help Labour a little bit.
Quite an interesting contrast there with the lack of leadership names on promotional papers as opposed to the election recently, 2017 election, where it was Theresa May, the presidential style, all over the bus. Let's just have a look at a graphic which shows Corbyn in comparison. Satisfied with way doing job, London 47%. Nationally 41%, dissatisfied 42%, 48%. Quite surprising there. There is quite a split there, even in London. 47% satisfied and dissatisfied 42%. There's still quite a lot of underlying scepticism, concern with him as well.
Yeah, he probably still would want to convince a bit more on ratings such as being seen as a capable leader and being trusted to make the right decisions if Prime Minister. But his ratings are better in London than elsewhere. And particularly what we find with Jeremy Corbyn is a very clear age split. So young people, and we know London is a younger city, young people are much more positive about Jeremy Corbyn and think he speaks to them much more than than older people.
Let's just have a look at one more graphic, which is economic optimism. An index. Our economy will improve over the next 12 months. London 14%. Both of those figures pretty pessimistic. Our economy will get worse over the next 12 months. 63%, 53%. They're not the most inspiring set of figures you've got going on. So most people are expecting the economy, or perhaps in their own pockets, to get worse. Will that, do you see that as having any impact in the way they're going to be voting?
It tends not to come up. What's interesting about the economy is there is this underlying level of pessimism, particularly in London, and probably Brexit is playing a part of that as well. But actually, when you ask people what are their most important issues, it's not quite as high as it used to be kind of 2008, 2009, post the crash. People are now a bit more worried about things like the NHS, public services, austerity, and then in London specifically, questions around housing, of course.
And Matt, nationally, I mean, you've got some... you've been looking specifically in some certain areas, Trafford, for example. I mean, what's your sort of top line if you were to look at the national picture, and what's going to be happening in May?
Yeah, it's a bit more difficult outside the major cities because in most other council areas there's only a third of councillors up for grabs, so it's harder for there to be any big changes. I was quite interested in the fact that Labour launched their local election campaign in Trafford. That looks like a really hard target for them to win outright. I think we're 10-1 that Labour gain control of Trafford. But it's the kind of place that they didn't always make a breakthrough in the 2017 election. I mean, Swindon's another one we've got some odds on. Again, Labour outsiders to take control, Tories control it at the moment. But Labour didn't win either of the Swindon seats in the general election. Now, if they could take control of the council in somewhere like Swindon, that might be a good sign that, that's not some kind of firewall the Tories have, but they could start winning in places like that.
What's quite interesting is, from this conversation is that, despite the fanfare of political coverage and the way it's been covered, there doesn't seem to be that much likelihood for many particular upsets and some massive changes going on. It all seems to be, maybe a few things here and there will shift, but roughly it will stay as it is now.
Yeah, there'll be some councils, there'll be lots of councils changing hands, but as I was saying, because only a third are up in most places, and the places where all the seats are up for grabs are outside of London are Manchester and Birmingham and Newcastle, places where Labour are firmly in control. That isn't going to change. I mean, Birmingham could be interesting because the Tories won the mayoral election there last year, so maybe they can make some progress there, but I don't think there's any chance that anything's going to change in terms of overall control of the council.
Yeah, and I think you have to remember that in 2014, actually, Labour did reasonably well in many of these areas to start off with, so they're starting from a higher base. So there may be less opportunities for lots of councils to change hand. At the same time, Labour's still going to be hoping to at least improve its vote share in many of these places, again, particularly in London, even if it's not actually leading to changes in council control.
Matt Shaddick of Ladbrokes and Gideon Skinner of Ipsos MORI, thank you very much.